having more acres of CRP could help with some of that. But I think the biggest things that we've seen from the farm level and in our industry and finance is that the expansion of trade, and of course China was a big one as that grew and expanded, and then we lost that. It's starting to come back again now. Ethanol has been big for us. The plant genetics and technology to produce the yields that we have all just been amazing. But we're still struggling, and the weather's been a problem. The price is terrible. We have good weather risk management tools with our crop insurance. But again, it doesn't even cover all of the costs. But we do need to be sure that the crop insurance stays strong and available to everyone. But now we need to do more to build back demand and improve our price. I think new products and use are important, but I thought Aaron had a good comment. And we need to have trade and move our products around the world. And I liked his comment when he said, when trade works, the world wins. People are hungry around the world, and we can provide that food.
Okay, great remarks, Howard. Thank you. Becca, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so 95% of the world's consumers live outside the US. So Cargill's mission in feeding people and animals, trade is critical in terms of what we do in moving commodities from areas of surplus to deficit. It's everything that we do. USMCA was a significant development, you know, maintaining and improving some key elements of NAFTA, preventing higher tariffs. You know, there are some key changes that were made with USMCA. Again, phase one, we've all been talking about that today. I think we're looking forward to how that's going to go. But commodity prices are they're a harbinger. So depressed farm prices are clearly a sign of what happens when you don't have open markets and free trade. So the supply chain is still under strain because of those geopolitical stressors. So we're not out of the woods.
Thanks so much, Becca. That was great. Harold, your remarks, please.
Well, the trade wars and the associated tariffs and retaliatory tariffs have proved challenging for the ethanol industry. And COVID, as mentioned earlier, has reduced fuel demand worldwide. And as a result, ethanol exports are struggling. You know, I think it's indicative of one of our issues. India was our third largest importer of ethanol last year at 202 million gallons, and it only uses it for industrial uses. It won't allow imported ethanol into the country for fuel uses. If we could get the government to change that, that is a potential billion-gallon market. So it's very important that the tariff and the non-tariff trade barriers are significant for the ethanol industry.
Excellent. Thanks, Harold. Tamara, your thoughts to round this question out?
Well, I think the panelists have done a fantastic job of answering it, and I'd like to turn it a little bit to say, what's the opportunity that we've had through this challenge? And I think one is that we will understand that we need to make some redundancies in our ag markets that, you know, I know as important as China has been, I think a lot of shippers and purveyors of products are going to look very carefully at some of the other smaller, more regional markets as a little bit of a hold up in case something continues to happen with China. But I would also say, I think the challenges with trade give us a real opportunity, and thanks to Farmers for Free Trade and others for talking so openly about it, is that everybody kind of knows about trade now. I mean, I think those of us who talked to each other in the same rooms back during the WTO and GATT, we all knew what trade was, but now people kind of get it. And what they probably still need to hear, though, is the point Becca made that, you know, 95% of the world's population lives outside of this country. We cannot have jobs and a successful economy if we do not export. And so I think it's a little bit of a plus for the consumer information about trade, and hopefully that will translate to legislators' appreciation of trade. Thank you.
Tamara, thanks so much. What really wise remarks from all of you for not only Minnesota Ag, but US and globally. So thank you so much. So Angela, we need to take a question from the audience. Do you have one?
I do, Barb, and good morning, everyone. Well, I'm very pleased that we have a very special guest who's joining us first, and it's Commissioner Tom Peterson, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Good morning, Commissioner Peterson.
Good morning.
You have the first question.
Well, thank you for everybody. It's great to see everybody. And thank you, Dr. Glenn, for moderating the panel today. And I wish that you could be here in person in Minnesota, and but great to have you virtually in Minnesota today. And appreciate your leadership through this. NASDA has been really invaluable for me as a commissioner. And great to see our panelists, Tamara, Becca, Howard, Harold, Kent, Cheryl. It's really, you know, it's been such an interesting year to manage through everything, and the last 5 months have been a whirlwind. And I think it was Howard that said, you know, the last 5 years had been such a tough year. And so it's easy to dwell on a lot of the negatives and everything we see. And kind of to what Tamara was just talking about, and Cheryl mentioned a little bit, I wonder about the lessons that we've learned in COVID, and what, you know, if we're magically done with COVID a year from now, or it's what are we going to have learned in COVID, and you know, kind of to that too, or if there's positive things that have come out in COVID. And I look at that and think about that, because I can list negatives this long, and but I think there are some things that we've learned that are positive for the food industry and trade. And so I just kind of open it to that as kind of what I'd love to hear this panel. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. That's a great question. I think there are lessons learned, and this panel seems somewhat optimistic this morning. So let's hear first from Tamara, and then we'll ask Cheryl to make some remarks.
Well, and I have the advantage of knowing a little bit that we have a Tanner Emke from CoBank coming to speak at our summit in November. And I had a long talk with Tanner last week about international markets. And you know, he said something very interesting, and I've noticed this with several analysts. They've looked at some of the countries that have handled COVID really well. And I think Europe in particular, and some of the Asian countries, and their growth is actually quite good. And with maybe some projections that the value of the dollar may be less next year because of our own economic challenges, I think there might be some really good opportunities next year for some expansion in ag trade, just because of the economic power of some of those medium-sized and larger markets that perhaps we have not shipped to in more recent years. So I'm going to hold that out as my hopeful, positive market comment.
Okay. Great, Tamara. Cheryl, do you have a remark for Commissioner Peterson?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly interesting question for AMPI, who operates 8 manufacturing facilities. We are analyzing the consumer purchasing data coming out of this period, and are seeing that Americans have gone back to the basics. They are seeking foods they're familiar with, comfort foods, think butter, cheddar cheese. For dairy, that has meant significant shifts, again, from food service to retail. Pay attention to these numbers, they're whoppers. Through July 12th, year-to-date retail butter sales are up 31.5%, and cheese is up 16.7%. That is significant. And will that shift continue? That is going to be a question that we're going to watch closely through our customers and consumers. Now let's take it to the farm level just briefly. I think that in the case of a cooperative like AMPI, we are going to continue to focus on a diverse manufacturing portfolio and customer base to keep the milk moving through all those sectors. And again, keep your eye on selling every drop of milk produced on member farms, and every pound of cheese produced by our AMPI employees. So that's our learning. That's our takeaway.
Cheryl, that's great. Commissioner Peterson, let's ask Farm Credit, Howard Olson, to make a couple remarks here. What's your lessons learned, Howard?
Yeah, I'll take this back again to how we conduct business. Through this, you know, our offices were closed from early March. Most of the other banks, most of the other farm credit offices, and yet this was our key time when we were working on operating loans, on crop insurance renewals, on tax returns, and so on with our customers. And just learning how to conduct business remotely and use the technology, to better use the technology to do it. You know, we've had DocuSign available for us to use and our customers to use, but it was just not catching on very much. People were slow to use it, and probably from our own internally, even our own staff was slow to use it. Once we closed offices, nobody had a choice. That DocuSign became the way to go. And it's just an indication, I think, of how part of this, one of the good things, Tom, to come out of this is just our better use of technology to conduct business.
That's a great comment, Howard. Commissioner Peterson, I hope there's a couple gems in there. We're going to move to another question, but thank you for your leadership with Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Thanks for being with us today. All right, panel, I think Angela has another question from the audience. So Angela, take it away, please.
I do. Also have a Q&A coming in as we're getting ready for our next front row to come in. The Q&A actually goes to Cheryl, and it says, how does trade play a role in your cooperative's mission for its farmers, and what do you see as your co-op's role as being on the trade front looking into the future?
You bet. I'm going to repeat a stat that I shared earlier, and that is 1 day out of every 7 is exported in the dairy industry. So 1 day of milk production out of every 7. So given that first of all is the critical point to make. But now let's go to cooperatives. Dairy is unique in that more than 80% of its production is sold, marketed through the cooperative structure. So these farmers, they own the entire system. They're all in and they're very vested. Personally, at AMPI, we think that once consumers beyond our borders taste our cheese, they're going to be hooked. We make award-winning cheese and butter from milk produced on our family farms, and we're anxious to share those products with the world at affordable yet sustainable prices for our dairy farmer owners.
Great question there. I'm going to ask John if he has some comments from CHS perspective on this.
Yeah, as I said in the opening remarks, CHS touches directly or indirectly nearly 700,000 farmers, and our role of creating connections to empower agriculture, we really want to represent the global access to the changing markets and be really flexible in providing those markets in these times. And I think that's a connection that CHS plays a critical role in representing to the congressmen and in the political arenas of what's really important to make them successful in our rural communities.
Thanks for providing those perspectives, John. I'm going to ask Becca for some comments from Cargill, and then Harold on this question. It's a good one. It applies to all of you.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I think Tamara talked a little bit about how trade is on the minds of most Americans, but I think we've seen it's still malleable and it's not a top priority. And so I think our role, we are able to help with the narrative around trade. I mean, we've started a platform fed by trade. So how are we bringing in true testimonials of employees, of farmer customers to talk about how trade has personally impacted them, and start elevating the conversation. So I think we're really trying to take a stronger role in that and making this more personal. We're not a cooperative, but we have a very diverse supply chain and a global touch and reach and many platforms that we're able to talk about it. So I think that's where we want to focus.
Yeah, thanks, Becca. And then Harold, what are your thoughts around this question?
Well, we're fortunate in this country that we can produce more ag products than we can consume, and that is truly a luxury that's not enjoyed by very many folks around the world. So, we are able to provide our renewable, sustainable products to everyone worldwide, and I think that's an important story.
Okay, excellent. Angela, I'm going to move ahead. I have another question for the entire panel. So that was great conversation. So panelists, for your industry, what are the countries and markets where you would like to see the U.S. government focus its attention to build your export opportunities? I know several of you have mentioned some things, but let's get these down on paper. Let's start out with John again here. We'll go down through the panel. John, thanks.
All right, thanks, Barb, for the question. Yeah, I can get really specific really quickly on this, and it's really just a numbers game, and it's China. While there's been great progress, there is tremendous opportunity, and the focus on tariff and non-tariff trade barriers into that country specifically just moves the needle so far, so fast that it's hard not to pick that as a top priority. There are many other countries, that we clearly want to get better access to, but it just is really hard with the numbers to top the focus on China.
Yeah.
We've seen great progress on soybeans, corn, and wheat in particular, but DDGs and ethanol are tremendous opportunities as well, and are enduring significant continued tariffs, and has become a barrier of the access and a place for us to relieve some of the pressure on that industry as well. Just as an example of more work that needs to be done that would be significantly impactful to our rural communities. So I think I'd have to just make it fairly brief and very specific that China needs to be a top priority.
Okay, John, thank you so much. We've got China on the list. Cheryl, what is your reaction here for dairy?
I'm going to take a little different angle. Just as our cooperative looks to diversify its product portfolio, I feel we need to look beyond our existing free trade agreements and seek new opportunities to avoid the pitfalls of concentration into a single region. Let's consider Southeast Asia, the Middle East, North Africa. Those are going to be important markets going forward because these regions are net importers of food and a likely complement to the year-round supplies available from the United States system.
Excellent. Thank you, Cheryl. Howard, what would you say here?
Well, for us, and the question was for your specific industry. Well, our farmers, we work with farmers from all industries. So I thought, John, good comments and opportunities in China. My thought is any place that is insulated from the politics of our nation's leaders. Can we add a do not touch clause be added to the trade agreements so we don't have these issues like what's popped up recently with China and with other countries through our tariffs and using, agriculture has just been used as a pawn for the politics of any country. And so again, if there's some way to work around that and not have that.
Yeah. Thanks, Howard. I'm sure there are many people nodding their heads. Okay, Becca, what are your thoughts?
Very similar. I mean, China goes without saying, but I think preserving the bilateral and multilateral agreements that we currently have, as kind of Howard was talking about, like a US EU, how do we prevent further erosion there? I think a thoughtful US UK. So I think the UK could potentially be another market to explore as well.
Excellent point. Okay, now where am I at here? Harold, we need to hear from you too.
Well, ethanol exports are dependent upon people driving vehicles. It's a fuel, and we need expanded fuel markets in order to export our product. China, certainly potential there, but under the current tariff situation, exports are not going to China. China had it's proposed a 10% ethanol blend for nationwide for its fuel. It's backed off that. If they would come back to that, they don't have the domestic production capabilities to supply their market. Brazil's been one of the top importers for us. They have a new program, Renova Bio, which should result in more exports to their country. Tariffs are an issue there. They have a tariff rate quota of 20% on anything over 198 million gallons. Mexico, a great destination for our corn and DDGS. And if they would go to a 10% blend, they could be a significant market for us. India, already talked about India and its industrial use and not using fuel ethanol. Southeast Asia is a tremendous number of people and growing middle class. It could be a significant importer of ethanol as well if the government regulations would allow the importation.
Okay, thank you, Harold. Tamara, do you have a comment here to end us up on
I
this?
do, Barb. I think, you know, my big dream is still that we get back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP now. You know, well, 6 of those countries we already trade with. And so it's more about gaining access. We've done that with Japan with that bilateral, but that would be my first goal. And then I'd echo Becca's comments on some of those other bilaterals that are in place or moving, US, EU, US, UK, just as a way to kind of spread out the risk of being completely tied to China. So I think also we could look to India. I think that's a huge and growing market, and their government has definitely slowed down on some of the little bit crazy phytosanitary and other rules they made up to keep our products out many, many years ago. So I think there's good opportunity there. I think they could be a good strategic partner. And so that would be my third vote.
Okay. Very good, panel. Thank you so much. There are plenty of consumers, as we said, 95% globally, that want access to U.S. products. So very good. So now I think we have a question from the audience. So I'm turning it over to Angela.
We do, everyone. And actually, we're getting lots of questions in the chat box. We're going to try to get to these. So we might just do 1 or 2 responses to each. But our next is coming in from Tim Weibel. Tim is the first vice president of the Minnesota Corn Growers. So Tim, I'm going to unmute you here.
Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Good morning, everybody. As farmers, we are increasingly adapting to more sustainable practices and improving our environmental outcomes. But one area that we still see a challenge is deriving a value in the marketplace for us to incentivize ourselves to implement more of these production practices. At Minnesota Corn, we've been working with some partnerships that will explore some of these things that will help us incentivize us as farmers for our sustainable practices. So my question would be, as a producer, how does this sustainable factor in your organization bring value back to us as growers?
Tim, that's a great question. We're going to ask Becca to talk about that because she was talking about sustainability. Cargill, a big user of commodities. Becca, go ahead.
Yep. I mean, this has been a question that we've been exploring. Consumers, as they're looking to make their choices, they aren't always willing to pay for, you know, whether it's organic or non-GM. That just seems to be a basic expectation. But I think that's changing a little bit. So we're seeing the ability to drive a premium for some of these specialty products. And so through our specialty lines, that's one way that we're able to bring that back to the farmer. But we're also seeing a lot of movement at the government. Local legislatures, even municipalities are seeing sustainability as a core element of their policies moving forward and identifying ways to incentivize those practices. Now that could change as a result of COVID. I know we're seeing some budgetary shifts as resources are being allocated elsewhere. But this is really embedded in the fabric of Cargill. I'm seeing it more embedded in all conversations across policymakers and elected officials. So I think as you take, you know, somebody like Cargill who will be able to pay for that, you know, non-GM corn that you're growing, but then also partnerships with, you know, Iowa Soybean Association and others as we work towards watershed and water quality, and seeing some government incentives to help promote some of that as well. So we're really trying to be the aggregator there, and how do we drive that back to the farmer customer?
Excellent. Thanks, Becca. I know Harold's dying to say something, but I'm going to move on, Tim. We're going to go to the next question. We've got a whole load of them here. Angela, go ahead, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a great, actually, media call coming in from Betsy Gibbon, who is with Ag Day and U.S. Farm Report. And Betsy's question is, what does a Biden presidency mean for agriculture? What does another 4 years of a Trump presidency mean for agriculture?
All right, here's a good question. I'm going to look at John first. I'm going to ask John what CHS thinks about that.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, well, I think, I boiled down, the continuation of the Trump presidency as simply more of the same that we have to be prepared for. And I think that's, fairly aggressive, as we've seen, and trade policies and tariffs and practices, a more protectionist lean. So I think we know what that looks like, and I wouldn't anticipate that would change. Maybe with a Biden presidency, I would suspect seeing maybe a tilt more focused on climate. Maybe that would give some lift to the biofuels storylines and help that industry out a little bit. And I think you'd see, a tempered trade versus what we see with the Trump administration, which would be favorable, in our view, versus, predictability and sustainability being really important.
Thank you, John. Very good. I'm going to ask Harold to comment on this. Great question.
I am always advocating for agriculture, and that is always top of mind. Who can we get elected that is going to understand agriculture and certainly work towards our success? And for the Biden presidency, I take some level of comfort knowing that both of our senators, who are Democrats, are advisors to his administration, would be advisors to. They certainly are supporters of his candidacy, and both of them certainly are well versed in agriculture and understand our issues. So I kind of look at that to be a plus, And with the Trump administration, I agree with John, probably going to get more of the same. He certainly understands that agriculture is out here in the center of the country, and he appreciates the fact that there was a huge red section in the center of the country. So, I'm hopeful that regardless of how the election comes out, agriculture can be well served by the administrations.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Harold. So Jody asked the question. Thank you, Jody, for being with us today. And we're going to move on to another challenging question right now. Angela, please go ahead.
So now we actually have Jody Longshore,
okay.
who's joining us.
Okay.
Perfect. Jody is the Vice President of Enterprise for Centera. Good morning, Jody.
Good morning. Thanks, Angela. So Centera is a Minnesota-based ag tech company, and one of the problems we're working on is to make it easy to aggregate and analyze data from a lot of different sources for the primary purpose of creating value for farmers and helping to improve in-season decision-making. We never share farmer data, but a farmer could choose to use the same information to verify production practices and measure sustainability outcomes. How do you see the changing trade, regulatory, and consumer requirements impacting the demand for increased ag supply chain transparency? And do you think having ready access to this information will create incremental value and market opportunities for agricultural producers and supply chain participants?
Okay, Jody, thanks so much. Sorry I had you confused there for a minute, but I'm going to go to Howard and ask Howard from his perspective how he would respond.
Jody, could you just bounce that off me one more time?
Yeah, can you boil that down, Jody?
Sure, yeah. So I think the question is, if farmers and supply chain participants have more ready access to data around production practices, do you think that will help them gain incremental market access or create more value for the supply chains in which they participate, given changing regulatory and trade environments?
Right. Yeah, I think as the consumers, just as consumers, we're going to continue to want more information about our food. We're going to put more demand on the suppliers, where it comes from, the producers, and so on. So I think all of that will help. I remember 20 years ago, we were talking so much about identity preservation in our crops and in our grains. And perhaps with the data that we have today and things like what your company is doing, we can be expanding that further. I think from our perspective, from the lender perspective, we like information, and the more data and the information that we can access, that the producer can provide to us, the better we can help serve that farmer as well. Our chief credit officer told me once a long time ago, poor information or lack of information makes a conservative lender even more conservative. So data is a plus from our perspective, and I think it would be from the consumer perspective as well.
Thank you, Howard. Well said. I'm going to ask Becca, from your perspective, what are your thoughts on ready access to data?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. As Howard mentioned, this is a growing expectation from consumers. And so as we are providing those services to our consumers, we're trying to gain their trust. It's all about information and access to it. You know, blockchain is everything. And when it comes to, you know, row crops, that's been a much harder piece for us to gather. You've got a trust component you need to work through. You've got data privacy issues that you need to work through. So that's a hard nut to crack. And so if you have that access to data, the more acres, the more practices, information is everything. It's everything for us, and it's everything for our consumers, for sure.
Yeah, really well said. So Tamara, I know you have some thoughts on this.
Thank you. And thank you, Jody, for that question. As someone who's worked in market research and sometimes correcting use of data, I would say I go back to what my college professor told me about computing, that garbage in is garbage out. And so I applaud the opportunity to have good data from farmers or from companies. And my thought would be that we need to work very hard along the whole food chain and at the academic level to make sure that it's a robust system, so that there's ways for new information, new learnings to come into whatever metric is being set. And I'll give the example of the California carb standard. I mean, that's something that was really not developed appropriately in the first place from an economic standpoint on ethanol. And so now we have ships of ethanol that come in from Brazil every night, and ships from the US that go and supply ethanol to Brazil from the US every night because of that carb standard. So it would just be the encouragement to build a super robust system and to involve ag in that. And I think it's a great tool that we'll be able to use in the future, not only with consumers, but with legislators and others.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Jody, thanks for the question. Panel, we're going to move on to a lightning round, but I'm going to double check with Angela. Angela, do you have anything else for us before we move to the next one?
Before we go into lightning round, I actually have two that I'm going to bundle, and maybe we can divide them up with quick answers because they're both really great questions. The first is the USDA's export development programs like MAP and FMD are important tools for foreign market development that demonstrate strong return on investment, but the funding has stagnated over the last 20 years. What can we do to help boost investment in those critical tools? Is question one. And question two, the U.S. Department of Agriculture said last Thursday that China purchased 1.9 million metric tons of corn to China. That topped the previous big purchase to China at 1.72 million, reported just 2 weeks ago. In a separate report, the USDA reported China purchased 1.9 million metric tons of soybeans, the biggest purchase since November. Exports are increasing. The question is, thoughts on those purchases?
Okay. I'm going to go to Harold first here. Harold, we need some quick answers here. I know you got them.
Absolutely. Not everybody knows MAP is Market Access Program, and FMD is not foot and mouth disease. It's foreign market development. So these are programs that come through the Foreign Ag Service. U.S. Grains Council is a recipient of those funds. It's their great public-private partnership. The U.S. Grains Council receives monies from all the corn grower associations in the state, in the nation, and couples it together with the government money and goes out and does market development programs. So, and U.S. Grains Council cannot lobby, so they rely on the National Corn Growers Association to lobby for them. So you bet this is top of the list for us when we start talking about farm bill negotiations. Increased funding for MAP and FMD are very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're all going to agree here. John, do you have a remark from CHS?
Yeah, I think it speaks to comments earlier around diversifying away from China and finding new markets and using all of the tools and resources that are available and that have been proven in our history to work. It's a really important addition to the portfolio in these very difficult times, and we very much would encourage the use of all tools available to us.
Yeah, and Cheryl, let's give you a chance too to talk at these two questions with respect to dairy. Cheryl, did you hear me? We can't hear you. Okay, all right. I still can't hear her. Angela, can you?
No, I think her other mute.
Okay. Okay, those were two amazing bundled questions. Cheryl, we're going to have to move on, unfortunately. So sorry, we cannot hear you. And I'm not good at reading lips. So Angela, do you have another question before we move to the final lightning round?
We've got some questions regarding the climate and other climate change policy, but I would say we are at the top of the hour, so we'll try to respond to those offline. Excellent questions, and want to make sure we have time to wrap up the program on time.
Okay, thanks, Angela. Yeah, let's definitely get to those after the event today. Okay, panelists, so it is time for the lightning round. And so I'm asking you to give very brief, concise answers on this one. And I think you're probably ready to do so. So this scenario is in place. It's January 21, the year 2021, and you're invited to a meeting with the President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, and the Senate Majority Leader. Regardless of who has been elected President, Speaker, and Majority Leader, what is the one thing you would ask them to do immediately to help American agriculture boost exports and improve profitability and competitiveness? So we're going to take this across the entire panel, and we're going to start with John.
All right, thanks, Barb. I think global market access is crucial for the health of our rural communities and the success of our farmers. So the focus on tariff and non-tariff trade barriers across the globe, I think we need to have an accelerated focus and an ongoing, extremely diligent efforts on reducing and removing as many of those as possible. And they come in small shapes and sizes and all over the globe. But the incremental demand that the export market takes has a disproportionate positive impact on our pricing for our farmers. And so I think that focus on removing all of those barriers in any way, shape, or form is where I would want them to focus on.
Okay, excellent, John. Reduce and remove. We got that message. Cheryl, what are your thoughts? I hope I can hear you this time, please.
I hope so too. Coming through? Very good. All right, I think I'm going to make it really simple. We need to expand trade and discontinue protectionist trade policies that hurt farmers and food producers. Trade goes all the way back to the family farm. And so let's remember this stat that for every dollar injected into the rural economy, we get about $3 back.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Great point. Howard, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm two things. First, I'm with Cheryl. Stop using food and egg products as a pawn in a political chess game with other countries. The second thing I think I'd throw out is add 5 million more acres of CRP to help reduce our large grain stocks.
Okay. Thank you so much. Becca.
I would bring them a pillow that has cross stitch of trade promotes prosperity and prosperity promotes peace as a reminder for all of them as they come into office. And then I think, one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, this is a hard, to boil this down to one ask, but remain a member of WTO. I think having the WTO re-solidified and re-energized and establish a rules-based trading system would be key.
Yeah, thank you, Becca. Glad you raised that one. Harold.
Pursue new trade agreements, free trade agreements in Southeast Asia, followed by increased economic partnership and trade agreements with African countries. And remember, when trade works, the world wins.
Excellent. Tamara.
Well, thank you. Those are all great. Yes, get trade, more trade, reminding people of trade. WTO, great point, Becca. I would go another direction as well and say, if nothing else, please in this nation, make the investment into the infrastructure that we need, locks and dams on the Mississippis, roads and bridges, and for goodness sakes, rural broadband. We've all realized the importance of that. And I think if you're gonna be navel gazing about what you do for America, if nothing else, take those $13 trillion that you proposed and go ahead and invest it in the infrastructure so that all of our businesses, including agriculture, can succeed.
Well, thank you, panel. I think that one thing that you would say was right on target. I think we should bring a little bit of Minnesota ag leadership to DC and much more often. So thank you so much for your wise remarks. So now before we close out this first Ag Talks town hall in Minnesota, I believe we have the results of 2 audience polls. So Angela, go ahead and share these with us, please.
Thanks, everyone. And so some of you should be able to see this on your screen, but we have the poll results in. Our first question was, do you believe that global trade should have fewer or more restrictions? An overwhelming 85% of you said fewer, 15% said more. Question number 2, US trade policy should, and it lists a number of options related to policy. So at 14%, enable American consumers to have the most choices at the lowest prices. At 6%, shorten the supply chain to have goods available faster. At 11%, make US manufacturers more competitive. At 31% are leading, develop new customers overseas. We certainly heard a lot about that today. At 6%, ease regulatory burdens. At 26%, ensure a level playing field. And then 6% at others. Thank you everyone for participating in the poll, and thank you for being a great audience as well today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Angela. Okay, thanks to our panelists and to our amazing audience today for such an informative and vibrant discussion. I thought it was top drawer. Thanks to AgTalks for the opportunity for me to moderate today's discussion. I really enjoyed it. And thank you to Minnesota Farmfest and Minnesota AgriGrowth for helping to convene today's town hall. And so with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Kent for some closing remarks this morning.
Wow, what a fantastic conversation we had today. We covered a lot of ground, from the discussion about new markets and customers, to tariffs and their impacts on American farmers, to discussions on how we can strengthen our supply chains. I want to take a moment to thank Dr. Glenn, our panelists, and most of all our audience for a great discussion today. This was really an all-star lineup. We'd also like to thank our AgTalks sponsors, including National Corn Growers Association, National Milk Producers Federation, U.S. Dairy Council, Farmers for Free Trade, Corn Refiners Association, Plant-Based Products Council, CAECO, ISOM, World Strategies, Fresh Produce Association of the Americas, the American Farm Bureau, and the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. Finally, I'd also like to recognize our Farmfest sponsors, including Ag Country Farm Credit Services, CHS, Minnesota Pork Producers, Minnesota Corn Growers, Minnesota Farm Bureau, and the Linder Farm Network. Thank you all for making this conversation possible through your generous support. On behalf of Minnesota Farmfest, AgTalks, and Minnesota AgriGrowth, thanks to all of you for participating today. The next AgTalks Town Hall will be held in partnership with the Michigan Wheat Growers. Will take place Thursday, August 13th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Remember that AgTalks Town Halls are virtual, so you can tune into the whole series, each of which will feature different panelists and cover different ground relating to trade, supply chains, and the future of American agriculture. Encourage you to register for the Michigan AgTalks Town Hall at www.agtalks.net. With that, thank you for your time, and thanks again to Dr. Glenn and our panelists. Please stay safe and tune in to other FarmFest events today and tomorrow, including our congressional candidate forums, the first one at 10:30 a.m. this morning and the second one at 1 p.m. this afternoon.
Thank you.